So I'm going to be talking a little bit about using R for geographic information system and landscape analyses. So Chell already mentioned my biography. I will point out in addition to what he said that none of this on this page has really included any formal training in R. I used it a little bit for my undergrad and in my master's, but when I was a GIS analyst before, it was using ArcGIS. So I have a little bit of, I learned R mostly through trial and error, and I took one course in the first year of my PhD that was taught by another grad student. So if I'm using incorrect terminology or anything at any point or messy code, please forgive me, but excited to kind of share with you what I have done in R and what I'm doing currently. So I'm currently a PhD candidate in biological sciences at the University of Calgary, and my kind of broad research focus is on how the characteristics of mountain landscapes influence the ability of bumblebees to survive, disperse, and adapt. So my plan for today is first to talk about a quick introduction to habitat fragmentation and landscape metrics, and then I'll go over to R and give a quick intro to GIS data in R, and then talk a little bit about how I've used R to measure habitat loss and fragmentation, and then bring it back to my research for the applications and kind of some of the results I found. So I've kind of assumed most people here have a at least a basic knowledge of R and maybe not a ton of knowledge of GIS. But if I'm going too fast or too slow at any point, please feel free to jump in and ask questions or type a question in the chat, and I will try to keep an eye on that. So I'll get started. So the key topic for today and for the first chapter of my research that I'm going to be talking about is habitat loss and fragmentation. So I'm sure probably everyone has heard about this in the news. It's one of the major factors influencing biodiversity around the globe. So habitat loss, we're probably all relatively familiar with. It's just the process of losing actual habitat area. So for example, if we go from this left landscape here to either of the two right landscapes, we're obviously losing some of this green habitat. And so that can occur independently of habitat fragmentation or at the same time. So here you can see from the left to the bottom right, we've lost both habitat, and the remaining habitat has become increasingly fragmented, where at the top, we've just lost the area of habitat. And so generally, the understanding is that as you lose area of habitat, you'll be able to support fewer species, just because there's going to be fewer resources available for them to use. So I've kind of showed that here. We have more bees on the left than on the habitats on the right. But you can also look at habitat fragmentation independently of habitat loss. So if we were to compare this top landscape with the bottom landscape, you can see there's the same area of habitat in both, but it's configured in a very different way. So here we have one big cohesive patch, and down here we have smaller fragmented patches. And so traditionally, the understanding was that habitat fragmentation and habitat loss were both negative for species and for biodiversity. So you'd expect to find fewer individuals in this patchier landscape down here than in the one up top. However, there was a meta-analysis done by Lenore Farrig in 2017 that showed when you looked at habitat fragmentation independently of habitat loss, the majority of significant effects were actually positive. So having landscape split into more patches could actually be beneficial for a lot of species. And again, I want to emphasize this is when you're considering it independently of the loss of habitat, which is pretty uniformly bad, it seems like. But when you're looking at just the arrangement of this habitat, sometimes it can actually have positive effects. So I know when I first read this, it seemed pretty counterintuitive. I think the narrative for a long time has been that fragmentation is bad as well as habitat loss. So I wanted to go through a few of the different hypotheses for why this might be. The first is that maybe there's a higher diversity of habitats. So when you have more patches spread across a bigger area of the landscape, and each habitat patch is unique, maybe there's different microclimates, different things happening in these small areas of the landscape that could be beneficial. Maybe I think the narrative again for a while was that edge effects were generally negative for species, but perhaps we're wrong in that too. Maybe things such as flowers at road margins can be positive for pollinators, and there's some of these edge effects that can actually be positive for species. Or maybe landscape complementation is something that can happen with a more fragmented landscape. So if a species needs to access, for example, both the green and the blue types of habitat, you can see in this right habitat where the blue is more fragmented among the green, there's more interface between those two types of habitats. So species that need to use both types of habitat can maybe access them both more efficiently in this more fragmented landscape. So these are the hypotheses, and how might we go about measuring some of these different types of fragmentation? So this is 3 different example landscapes. Each of them has the exact same proportion of this green habitat. It's 27% of the landscape in all of them. But as you can tell, they're obviously very different. So first you can look at the number of patches, which helps you distinguish between this right-hand landscape and the 2 on the left. So the one on the right obviously is 9 patches, and these 2 just have 1 big patch. That doesn't help us to distinguish between the left patch in the middle, or the left habitat and the middle habitat though. So for those, you can look at something that related to the length of the edges. So something like edge density. Here I've just counted the total length of edge, but you would generally average that over the area that you're calculating it over. And then finally, you can look at complementary edge length. So if you're interested in maybe green or the light green and the dark green habitats, you can actually go and count the length of the edge that separates them. So in this habitat, it would be 4, and here it might be closer to 20. And so these can be related back to some of these hypotheses. So the high diversity of habitats, you can broadly estimate by using the number of patches, just based on having more distinct patches spread over a bigger space. Edge effects obviously is related to edge density. And then landscape complementation is related to that complementary edge length. So with that kind of background in mind, I'm now planning to move over to RStudio to show you some of the brief introduction to just how do we look at spatial data in R. But before I do that, any questions so far? Maybe while I do that. All good, okay. Okay, and now can you see RStudio?
I can.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so first of all, introduction to GIS data. The first thing I want to talk about is 2 different types of GIS data to keep in mind. The first is called vector data, and that's basically anything that's located in a discrete location. So that can be points or lines or polygons. Let's zoom in, okay. Is that better? Okay, hopefully that's better. Sorry, and this is all the background too. So first of all, I'm just talking about these 2 types of GIS data. So vector data was those discrete objects in space. So things that would be represented by points, lines, or polygons, where obviously you'd use the coordinates of the points, either connecting lines or connecting the outline of a polygon. Raster data is for more continuous data across space. And so that would be basically a grid in space where each pixel in the grid would have a unique value. So if you think of a digital photo, each pixel has a value for color. Or if you think of, you can look at an elevation data across space, and you'd have basically a grid where each location on the grid, you'd have an example, for example, an elevation value there. And each of these can be represented differently in R. So I'll start out with vector data. And here, I'm just going to make a really simple data frame where I'm going to give a unique ID from 1 to 20, and then assign random X and Y values for coordinates, and then just random count data that we're going to say we collected at each of these random locations. So you can see down here, it's just a really simple data frame. And if we were to plot it with the X values on the X axis and Y on the Y axis, you can see now we basically already have spatial data where the X and Y coordinates are now plotted over what could be considered space. So obviously this is really simple, but just to kind of think about how this is structured. And so the simple features package in R is one that actually can be used to look at some of these some spatial data and has additional functionality. So if I load the package, and I can use this ST as SF tool, and I'm basically going to use this random points layer that I created up here and assign the coordinates for X and Y to just be the X and Y columns that we made. And so now if we look at the head of the points file, we can see it's a simple feature collection with geometry type is point and dimensions. And you can see in here, it has kept our location ID and count columns, but it's now added a geometry column where it's kind of amalgamated the X and Y values, and it has it down as a point value with those locations. And so with this, it's easier you can just plot it and it'll automatically use this geometry that we created over here. The simple plot feature will plot it for values of each of your columns. So the location ID and count are each being represented in different colors. If I just wanted to look at the points, you can use the ST geometry function and then plot it there. And so this will show you where your points are located over space. And for raster data, similarly, I'm just going to create a matrix with values from 1 to 100 in 10 rows and 10 columns. So it would look like this. And then if you use the image function, you can plot it. And so again, if you imagine X and Y are just locations in space, this could be spatial data. And similarly, I can just make a different matrix where I'm going to randomly sample values of 1 to 3, and it would look something like that. And so you can take this kind of pixel values and use the raster package in R. And the function is just raster. And then I'm going to specify this matrix that I used before and just tell it that the maximum value of X and the maximum value of Y is 40 for both. And so now when I plot this, I now have a legend for the values of each pixel. And then I still have what we're imagining as the coordinates in space along the X and Y. And because I created my points over the same value, I can add them on top. And so now we can imagine these are points over this landscape of the raster that we created. So that's basically a really quick intro to just kind of visualizing these different types of GIS data in R. There's a few other ways you can interact with spatial data in R. There's a zoom function, and you can manually pick 2 points. So say I wanted to zoom in here and here. It allows you to zoom into that area of the landscape represented by this, it's pretty small, but this thin red box here. And you'll notice it only will zoom in. I specified zoom in on the raster, so it's only zoomed in on the raster. The points aren't showing up in the zoom window. You can also draw polygons in. So I'm going to draw a polygon and assign it to, I'll just abbreviate the area of interest. And so now it's running and you can see locator active. And so say I wanted to draw a polygon around here, I can just click points and either click escape or finish. And you can see this new red line. So I've basically created a new spatial object. And so I can redraw that. And it's a really thin line. You can see now we have this polygon here as well. And if I look at the head here, so now it's a spatial polygon and we have the extent of the max min values here. Another quick and interesting thing you can do, use the spatial sample tool to sample within this polygon that I just created. And I'm going to create 20 random points, which I can then plot. You can see they're showing up in here. So this is obviously cool that you can do. I wouldn't necessarily recommend creating a bunch of data in R. It's probably easier to use something like QGIS, a bit more functional, but it is something that you can use in case you just want to create quick spatial data in R. And so, yeah, obviously if this is of limited use, it's going to be better to use R if you can load data from other sources. Luckily, that's also pretty easy to do. So I just have this points file that I created in QGIS, and it's a shape file, and I can read it in using the read simple features. And I'm going to assign it to example spatial point, and now I can plot it. And so here is what these points look like, but it's not very informative. I don't know where in space I am. So I can add the axes equal true. And now we have coordinates on the axes. So if I zoom in, I can see here the decimal degrees, and this is where these points are located in space. And if I look at the header of these points, I can see point value, the min and max values, and then if this is CRS stands for coordinate reference system, so that basically indicates how these points are projected in space. So the WGS 84 is a geographic coordinate reference system. So that's basically decimal degrees all the way across the globe. It's not trying to be projected onto a flat map, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then we can also see the geometry here. Similarly, we can load land cover data. So here, this is external land cover data from a different source. And my computer's a little bit slow, but here it's being represented. And I can use the zoom function again, just to see a bit closer what it looks like. And so this is land cover data, where each pixel has a value that is representative of a different land cover type. And so this, I drew the points so that they would be on top of this land cover. But unfortunately, when I plot them, they don't show up on the map. So if I look at the land cover data, I can look at the structure of it, and it's stored as a raster layer. So it has all these slots that give us information about where in space it's found and how it's stored. But what I want to look at is this coordinate reference system. And I can see here that it's projected in UTM, or Universal Transverse Mercator, with a different datum and units of meters. So if you remember, when we were looking at the points, they were in decimal degrees. So this one has been projected. So basically when you take a globe, which is round, and then you try and put it onto a flat surface, there's different ways of doing that, and that are kind of specified to different areas of the globe. So when it's projected, it's basically being put onto a flat surface, and you'll have units like meters instead of degrees, and it's easier to calculate, for example, distances between points when you have these projected coordinate systems. So that's kind of one of the tricky things sometimes is dealing with GIS data. If you're getting it from different sources, sometimes it'll be in different projections, even though it's in actually the same area of space. So if we needed to put it so that it actually shows up on the same location, you can do what's called reprojecting it using the ST transform function. And so I'm going to transform these spatial points. And here I'm just going to tell it to basically use the coordinate reference system from our land cover class. And then when I do that, if I add on my points, you can see they're now showing up on this map. So that's a really whirlwind introduction to GIS data and some of the kind of simple basic, or some of the basic functions you can do with it. I'll stop there if anyone has any questions or anything you'd like clarified before I keep going. Okay, I will keep going then. So now I'm actually going to move on to landscape analyses. So I'm using a couple different packages here to look at some of the things I talked about earlier. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a simple landscape using the landscape R package. So first I'm going to create a blank matrix, and then like I did before, I'm going to turn it into a raster. So if I plot it, it's basically blank, all the values are 0, and it's going from 0 to 40 again. And I'm going to use the landscape R package. And here you can use the make class function. And I'm going to basically, in my blank raster, create 7 different patches, each patch of a size of roughly 100 pixels, and give it the value of 3. So now if I plot it, I can see my background value of 0. And because I created so many patches and they're so big, they've kind of merged together. So I've only created 2 big green patches. But I can do this again. This one I'm going to create only 3 patches, make them a bit smaller, and give it a value of 2. And with the background 0, 3, I'm basically indicating that it can add over either value. So 0 or 3 can be used as the background to draw over. So now I have 3 smaller patches of the second category, and I'll do it one more time and make 10 small patches, which I can plot. So now we have 4 different types of line cover if you include this background over this pretty simple landscape. So now the first thing that we want to look at is the proportion of landscape covered by these different habitats. Obviously, that's going to be important for any species using a landscape. So you can calculate the proportion of landscape covered by each line cover class using the basic frequency function of raster. And so if I look at this data frame, basically it's just counted the number of pixels of each value. And so if I just divide those counts by the total number of pixels, now I've got the proportion of landscape in my little data frame. So that's obviously pretty straightforward. You can also use the landscapemetrics package to calculate that in just one step. So the landscapemetrics package has a whole bunch of different metrics that are related to landscape types that you can calculate. So you can identify them. It's basically LSM for landscape metric. C stands for class. So basically I want to average over every land cover category or class. So I want a value for all of the values of 0, all of the values of 1 or 2, and that would be as opposed to calculating statistics for each individual patch or across the entire landscape. So that's the C there. And then PLAND is just proportion of landscape. So if I do that, now I have a tibble where for each of the classes, it's calculated the proportion of landscape, which you can see matches the values that we calculated manually up there, but we can do it in just one step. And so you can use this for all of the different, there's a whole list of functions that you can do. I've just kind of picked the 3 I'm talking about today, but if you go into the vignette or the manual for this package, you can see all of the different metrics that it can calculate. So the next thing I do is look at the number of patches in the landscape. So if I look at, you can use the show patches tool from landscape tools and do it for this random landscape that I created. And now it's going to split out for each of the land cover classes, all of the different patches. So if you wanted to go through and see manually where all your different patches of each category are located, you could do that. And then again, the landscapemetrics package will calculate it for you automatically. So you can see for the class 0, we've got 12 different patches. For class 1, there's 4, 2, there's 3, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, and again, landscape metrics are using class and then number of patches. And finally, you can use it to calculate edge density. And again, I'm just modifying this the last 2 letters. And here I'm going to calculate edge density, and it'll do the same thing. And so it's obviously interesting to do this over an entire landscape, but what I was interested in doing is calculating it around specific sampling points so that we know at a certain location where we have data, what's going on in the landscape surrounding it. So I'll just quickly plot our landscape, and these are some example sample points that we created earlier. They're just random, but this would in theory be something that you've picked ahead of time or places that you've sampled. So you can create buffers around the points using the st buffer function. So I'm going to create them around our points, and then I'm just telling it to do a distance of 5. Here it's basically just 5 pixels, but if you had a projected feature, then it would obviously be like in meters or degrees or whatever your units are. So if I run this, and now I can plot, and you can see all of these circles being drawn around all the points. So I basically just buffered each point. And now we have a new polygon class. And if we look at the polygon class here, we can see geometry type is polygon. The coordinate reference system, I haven't assigned one just because this is a quick example and it's not relevant. But usually when you're doing GIS in R, you'd want to make sure that it's in the correct coordinate reference system. So again, that would be something like NAT 83, where it's projected in meters, or something in decimal degrees. And the other thing I wanted to point out is now that we have a polygon, our geometry is basically a list of a whole bunch of coordinates that would basically be each point that connects the whole line of the polygon. And so if I wanted to calculate metrics around each point, I'm just going to make an empty data frame, and then we'll just show you with one example. So for each of points that we created, I'm going to select a single buffer feature, and then you can use the mask tool from raster to clip the raster to this buffer that I just selected. And then if I plot the raster, you can see it's being clipped now to this little area around the point. And then you can use calculate landscape metrics to basically pull in, before we are running each metric independently, but this calculate landscape metrics will run them all at the same time. So for this raster, I'm going to calculate the proportion of landscape, the number of patches. Here I'm just, oh, I guess if I do this, and then I'm getting this warning because I don't have the coordinate reference system like I mentioned earlier. But now I can look at this table I just created. And for each of the classes, I now have a metric and a value. So I'm going to do one more thing and just assign values of 1, or basically the value for ID that's going to match it back to my point. And if I run this for the beginning, for all of my points, now for each of the polygons here, I have for each class a metric and a value. And I think there's a question in the chat. Issues with the program freezing when using SF to read in a multi-polygon shape file. Those are being clipped, etc. in QGIS. Yeah, I'm guessing it's probably a pretty big file. And yeah, I guess my advice would probably depend on what you're using it for too. If you can, sometimes if it's like a really complex file and you don't need that amount of complexity, you can use like the simplify tool in QGIS to kind of, if it's got a ton of lines and you don't really need that amount of precision, you can simplify and it'll basically take out some of the points that are delineating that polygon, and that sometimes makes it a bit of a smaller file and easier to work with. So you could start with that if you don't need that exact level of complexity on your polygon. Sure, yeah, or there's a Slack channel you could ask. I think it probably would be a little bit specific to what you're actually doing and what you're aiming to get out of it. And yeah, we can talk about that later too. Sorry, I don't know if that's helpful. So back to this with the points. So now we have this tibble or data frame now, where we have basically all of the data around each of our polygons or points. And if I just tidy the table, I can make it so that I have, for each of my original sampling points, I have all of these landscape metrics surrounding them, and then this count value, which we basically just made up, but we're assuming it's a data that we've collected at that point. And so you could then use this for something like a model, where you can model the count data by some of these different landscape features that you think would be relevant to what you've done. And here it is nothing insignificant, which we would expect because it was all just completely made up random data. But that's kind of how you could use some of this. Again, kind of threw a bunch of stuff at you there. Any questions for now? Package run tables, so that's the tidyverse. I'm not actually sure which one of the tidyverse packages. It might be dplyr. But yeah, part of the tidyverse made it tibbles, and I think it was probably also associated with the landscape metrics package. I think would probably load it if I didn't already have it loaded. Okay, so okay, are you seeing my presentation again?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to bring it back to my research and how I've used some of these tools in R. So the question I was asking was, how does habitat fragmentation influence bumblebees in naturally heterogeneous landscapes? So the kind of motivation behind this was to look at in these mountain habitats where obviously, as you can see in this example, there's a ton of different types of habitats in really close proximity to each other that are relatively free from anthropogenic influences. So they're not heterogeneous because we've done that and we've done forestry or made cities. They're naturally like this. So it helps eliminate some of the kind of temporal lags that might happen between when humans influence landscape and when species respond to it. So that's why I picked this habitat type. So I had a few different objectives. The first was to look at whether bumblebee abundance is correlated with the amount or the arrangement of habitat land cover, so related to habitat amount and fragmentation, if we can pick apart the influence of one versus the other. And then if there is an influence of land cover arrangement or fragmentation, is it positive or negative? Kind of going back to that earlier meta-analysis that I showed you, are we supporting it? Is this something that happens in bumblebees in these natural environments? And finally, can we learn anything about potential mechanisms behind this relationship? So to do this, I basically picked a bunch of sites located throughout kind of the Rocky Mountains and foothills of Alberta. So these yellow triangles are sites we sampled in 2017, and then the orange triangles we sampled in 2019. And at each of these locations, we sampled 4 different sites that were selected to try and cover a range of both the amount and configuration of habitat. So it had varying levels of habitat amounts and varying levels of fragmentation of those habitat types. And we sampled using blue vein traps. So you can see that's this trap in the corner of the picture here. It's basically bumblebees are attracted to the bright blue color, and then they fly in and we fill them with propylene glycol to preserve the bees. And we sampled from June to August in 2017 and 2019, and then went back and checked the traps every 2 to 3 weeks. And then we took the bees back to the lab to identify them to species. Then used Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute land cover data, which there's an example in this picture below, and used it to calculate landscape metrics within 300 meters of each site. So with this inner buffer, and then also from 300 to 600 meters. And we chose these distances to be based on previous estimates of mean bumblebee foraging distance. So basically wanted to characterize the landscape that the bees would be most likely to interact with on a regular basis. Today, I'm only going to be talking about the results within 300 meters just for the purposes of time, but we did also look a little bit further as well. And we looked at 4 main land cover types. You can see here, there's quite a few different land cover classes that can be found, but we focused on 4 that we thought would be relevant for bumblebees. So the first is grassland, which can be important foraging habitat for them. That would include things like alpine meadows and flowers where they would forage and get resources. Forest habitat can be used for their nests. So they'll sometimes burrow in, or they won't burrow, but they will find holes that have already been burrowed into the ground and they can nest there. So forest can be good for that. Developed, we thought would probably negatively influence the bumblebees if the ground is covered, or if it's human anthropogenically modified, it's probably not going to be as good habitat for bees. And then finally, shrubland. We didn't have a clear hypothesis about it beforehand. We thought it might include also floral resources or maybe nesting habitat for bees, but in this habitat we weren't exactly sure. So we modeled both with and without the shrubland to see which one better represented our data. And so created models of bumblebee abundance as a function of the period collected, so whether it was earlier or later in the season and whether it was in 2017 or 2019, as well as topographical variables such as elevation and the distance north. And we just put those in the model to try and kind of pull out those effects from the land cover effects that we were interested in. And then looked at these 4 different landscape metrics that I mentioned earlier. And as a reminder, these were related back to some of these original hypotheses. So number of patches, edge density, and complementary edge length. And so these are our results. Basically, these dots and lines represent the estimate of the coefficient and the 95% confidence interval. So if they're to the left of this dotted line of 0, then we expect to have a negative relationship with bumblebee abundance. And if they're to the right, they probably have a positive relationship. And so the first thing, all of these categories up here, while some of them are significant, these were just things we wanted to pull the variance out of the model. So we found more bees later in the season, fewer in the mountains and the foothills. We found fewer at higher latitudes and fewer in 2019 than 2017. Well, that was important to pull out. What wasn't really the focus of what we're doing. What I wanted to focus on was the rest of this plot. So on the left, we did a plot or did a model with the number of patches, and on the right was the model with the edge density, just because while we tried to make sure they weren't correlated, it was hard to do in a natural landscape that we can access mostly by hiking. So we did end up having these two variables be a bit more correlated than we wanted to put in a model together. So we had two separate models, and that's why the p-value is 0.025. It's just been for a Bonferroni correction for multiple comparisons. So if we look at first the number of patches model, we can see that the number of patches of coniferous forest wasn't significant, but the number of patches of grassland and shrubland had a negative effect. So as the habitat was split into more patches throughout the landscape, we tended to find fewer bees. So if we bring this back to our hypotheses, this suggests that this higher diversity of habitats probably wasn't having a significant influence on bumblebees, or at least not a positive one. And similarly, if we look at edge density, the only one that was significant was the edge density of shrubland. And again, that had a negative effect. So having a greater amount of shrubland edges we tended to find fewer bumblebees in those areas. So again, suggests that probably positive edge effects aren't really happening, at least in these landscape types. But finally, we can look at the complementary edge length, and here it's actually positive. So when we had a greater amount of complementary habitat between grassland and forest edges, then we tended to find more bees. And this was significant in the number of patches model. The p-value was 0.0506, I think, in here, but not significant after Bonferroni correction. But still the trend in both was for this positive relationship. So here, this suggests that of these three hypotheses, probably the landscape complementation is maybe the most likely mechanism to be operating in this environment. So this brings me to some of the conclusions from this work. So we found that bumblebee abundance is correlated with both the amount and the arrangement of habitat. So both were important, and the direction of the relationship depended on the measure of fragmentation that we used. But overall, our evidence was supporting landscape complementation as a mechanism for positive fragmentation effects. And I wanted to thank all the people who helped out with this research. It was a lot of time spent in the field collecting bumblebees, and a lot of time looking at individual species, which is another part of this that I didn't show today, but many people made it possible, so thank you. And that is the end of the presentation for today. So thank you very much for sticking with me through it. And yeah, if anyone has questions or wanted to discuss anything, happy to do that.